wet tropics of Australia is a biodiversity hotspot. Unfortunately, due to agricultural use and deforestation, a lot of the rainforest have been cleared. A lot of ecological restoration attempts have been made to restore the land and biodiversity. So here on the tablelands is a great place to really test out effectiveness of those restoration methods. One very cost-effective way of doing this is by using a bioindicator species. A bioindicator species is a sensitive and ecologically important species that can be monitored to track changes in the ecosystem.
Dung beetles are really useful bioindicators because they are ecologically sensitive and they're functionally important. Obviously they rely on mammal dung, so they are very good indicators of what's going on with the mammal community. They're also very sensitive to any changes in habitat disturbance because they're very sensitive to things like temperature, humidity, and other environmental changes.
Dung beetles can be sorted into functional guilds, or groups of species that perform similar ecological roles. These are based on factors such as size, dung use, and Diel activity. In Australia, we have rollers and tunnelers. Rollers will take a piece of dung and roll it away before burying it and laying their eggs, where tunnelers will dig straight down from wherever the dung was laid.
You can also look at kind of other behavioural activities like Diel activity because it tells us a lot about how they divide themselves up in terms of niche partitioning, in terms of the competition in the ecosystem as well.
So Diel activity is the activity that animals exhibit throughout the day. Some species are diurnal, which means they're active during the day. Nocturnal is active at night, and crepuscular is transitional periods like dawn or dusk. Since dung beetles decompose fresh mammal feces, their Diel activity can tell us about the Diel activity of the mammals in that ecosystem, and understanding dung beetle Diel activity can also give us insight into which functional guild these beetles belong to, which can allow us to understand which ecosystem niches and services they'll provide. Diel activity patterns in the wet tropics are largely unstudied, which represents an important gap of our understanding of these ecosystems. So to address this, we're conducting a two-part study investigating Diel activity and species diversity of dung beetles in the wet tropics across differently aged restoration sites. Once we understand those patterns, they can be used more effectively to assess ecosystem recovery in tropical rainforest systems.
And here at CRS, we have a really nice kind of suite of different types of ecological restoration along kind of like a restoration gradient. So by kind of looking at each of those and using a bioindicator like dung beetles, it can really help us look at those very subtle differences between those restoration types.
For data collection, we selected 5 sites here at CRS with varying vegetation types, restoration practices, and timelines. Our sites listed in order from most to least disturbed are abandoned pasture, consisting mainly of tall grasses and serving as a baseline for comparison. 3 sites that are currently in recovery. Regrowth, which began regrowing on its own after being abandoned in 1978. Old Orchard, that was home to various non-native fruit trees before being abandoned in the 1980s and regrown in the 2000s. Ecological planting, that was intentionally restored in 1993, following its abandonment in the 1970s. Lastly, our site Mature Rainforest, which has never been cleared or significantly disturbed and acts as our target site for the rest. At each site, we created a 30-meter transit line at which we marked every 10 meters and placed 2 traps on either side, totaling in 8 traps per site. We used standard baited pitfall traps. Setup included digging a hole into the ground, above which a ball of dung or mushroom hung off a small metal grate. We collected from the traps 6 times a day.
Across all of our diversity indices that we measured, including average trap richness, evenness, Shannon's diversity index, which is a combination of the two, and abundance, we found that our 3 recovering forest sites, including Old Orchard, regrowth, and ecological planting, were much more similar to that of the mature forest than that of the pasture. The richness and Shannon's diversity index of our 3 recovering forest sites were not significantly different from that of the mature forest, while only the regrowth had a significantly lower evenness. Only 2 beetles total were collected in the pasture, which drove stark differences in community structure indices and impacted our ability to calculate evenness for that site. Notably, we also found that all of our recovering forest sites had a significantly higher abundance than that not only of the pasture, but also the mature forest. A visualization that collapses variables related to community structure down to 2 dimensions also showed clustering between these recovering forest types. Even though they aren't identical to the mature forest, they're still much closer to it than that of the pasture, which couldn't even be visualized on the same plot.
The recovering and mature forests have very similar species composition and diversity, indicating that they have become very similar, which is the ultimate goal of restoration. However, there were significantly different abundances of beetles when comparing different habitat types. So while we know that the recovering forests are becoming more similar to the primary rainforest, they are not yet the same. Recovering forests might be having a larger number of beetles because of the presence of habitat generalists like bandicoots. They can survive in a variety of ecosystems, create an increased abundance of dung for beetles to use. When analyzing the presence of each functional guild across habitat types, we noticed that tunnelers are most present in the younger recovering forests and that their numbers decrease as the age of the forest increases. This is likely because most of the tunnelers that we found were from the Coptodactyla genus, which are habitat generalists, meaning they can withstand a variety of ecosystem conditions. Rollers are not as abundant in the secondary forest habitats, but are just as abundant as the tunnelers in the mature rainforest. Mature forests have the most stable climate of all these habitat types, which is ideal for our rollers and allows them to have a better chance at competing with tunnelers for dung. While these results conclusively tell us about the dung beetle community here at CRS and the success of these restoration efforts, it was only from a small snapshot of time during one season.
We also classified each of the species we had at least 5 observations for into Diel groups based on when they were found throughout the day. This resulted in 2 nocturnal species, both in the Temnoplectrum genus, and 4 crepuscular species. The nocturnal species were found relatively evenly throughout the night, while the crepuscular species were found primarily at dusk.
Previous studies around the world have found that small rollers tend to be most active during the hottest parts of the day, because they are small and therefore expel heat faster, and also because rolling takes more energy than tunneling, so large tunnelers are more suited to being crepuscular or even nocturnal. However, we found that here the opposite is true. The small rollers were more active throughout the colder parts of the night than the large tunnelers, who were more distinctly crepuscular, with a large activity peak at dusk and a smaller one at dawn. This is likely due to the fact that most native mammals are most active around dusk, and the large tunnelers are able to outcompete the small rollers, forcing them to be more active throughout the night to access the dung, which is made possible by the relatively low temperature fluctuations in the wet tropics.